I'm Natalia O'Sullivan and I am the co-author of the Ancestral Continuum. This book is based on a lot of the work that I have done over the last 20 years with clients and workshops, which is created really with anecdotes, stories and workshop material in the book to help people recognise the significance of knowing who they are is connected with their family history. I think it's important for people to remember the circumstances of their birth and the moment that you arrive. So if we look at that in the sense of generational, we also look at the circumstances of our parents, and so how they felt about each other when we were conceived, our relationship with them, their relationship also with each other and the other siblings. So for instance, it's a very different energy if you come into the family first or second or third, or if you're an only child, or if you're adopted. And so I always take people back to that very beginning, that moment where you were brought into the world. And that is also the beginning of all the family shadows, I call. They start to kind of build up around you. And so if you're, for instance, if your parents were very happy, they wanted you, there's a different personality, you could say, that envelops us. And also our bonding as well when we're very small. My circumstances were quite interesting and typical of a lot of the generations that were born in the 60s. My parents weren't married when I was conceived. I had this mix of my father's Hungarian and my mother's Spanish. They both they didn't speak the same language, which was quite very interesting. And eventually my father decided that he would marry my mother. But I knew it was very turbulent. They had to learn about each other through my pregnancy, through my early childhood. And I think that it gave me the courage not to, to belong. And it felt that I didn't belong to them because I don't think either of them really wanted to be married or wanted to have me. But by the time my brother was born, who was the second baby, they were very much in love, and his whole personality, his relationship with them is significantly different to the one that I have with them. And I always say to people, you know, it's interesting, if you're adopted, they are the most interesting studies of people that have been adopted, particularly before the 1970s. So there was a time between 1950 and 1970s. And if you were adopted during that period, there is a significant feeling of abandonment and loss and insecurity, because there is such a sense, even as a child, that you know you were not wanted. Even if you are adopted into an amazing family that adore you and love you, there's always this sense there was this enormous rejection that happened at an early part of your life. And so also talking about adoption and biological and adopted family energy, that's also very interesting. People often ask me, well, you know, how come that my adopted family ancestry feels more connected with me than my biological? And that happens a lot. Early childhood is the beginning of us acknowledging where we belong and where we don't belong, but also taking that kind of mix of family traits and the environment that you're brought up in is very important to make you who you are. And accept some of those things that sometimes make you uncomfortable. And forgiveness, I always get people to work a lot with forgiveness and their relationship with their family. If it was difficult when they were little, as adults, there needs to be a point where we have to kind of remanage. I call it the inner child, for them to feel like they feel safe and loved again. What's interesting is that you not only unravel these creative, inspired spirits, but you also can connect with ancestral pain and suffering. And what I mean by that is that we can also, some of us can inherit some of the darker aspects of our family history. And so as we go back, we often then find characters that didn't have such high morals, or very wounded or very sick. And one side of my family, which has a great influence on us, is addiction. That's and also anxiety and depression. But we can also look at what's happened to people in different generations, which I wonder sometimes whether that has influenced that character. So it's not always something in a person's soul that wants to make them very unhappy or very villainous. It's sometimes circumstances. So if we look back, so For instance, there is definitely an anxiety that runs through my mother's side, and my mother carries this as well. And of course, if we look back to what happened to her mother, she lost her husband at a time in Spain where she was ostracized, persecuted. People that were Republicans weren't allowed to work or even to go into certain shops. So they had this terrible sense of fear and loss that she carried. And I can really experience that with my mother and how she brought me up. She was very overprotective and very anxious all the time. And interesting being a mother myself is that I realise that there are pointers that I can recognise when I'm with my behaviour that I've tried to manage, because I know that as a person, I'm not naturally anxious, but I've seen where the generations have kind of led me to experience that. And so with my daughter, for instance, she recognises that if there are pockets that make her feel troubled or worried, she knows how to manage it. But it's the same thing as families that have addiction as well. That is a terrible genetic disposition, addiction and depression. And so for instance, I have people that I've helped through workshops and see me for one-to-one sessions that have got family history. There's a young woman I saw recently who's pregnant, and her family are Russian Jews. Now, her parents are very, they're first generation here, they're very happy, but she said it's interesting, both sides of her family have a terrible fear of loss of money and also health. So there's a terrible anxiety. And so we looked back, we went and journeyed back further back, and her grandparents and her great-grandparents suffered terribly coming over from Russia with no money, no housing. And some of them actually lost their children, people died. So this terrible fear of not having enough, and also the health issues, she knows that travel down from experiences that her own ancestors went through. One of the really interesting areas is to what I call bloodlines, where women sort of notice that they may have problems with fertility or lots of miscarriages, and sometimes there are generations of women that have had children out of wedlock. There are patterns that you recognise in personalities and characteristics. And so what's interesting is when you're pregnant for the first time, a lot of those memories, ancestral memories, actually start to grow inside you. Because of that, there is this memory, this emotional memory that runs through our physical body. Now, what we've done is that we've done some research on how women give birth or how they have fertility issues. And often, if you look back into their family history, there are significant traumas that their mothers and grandmothers have experienced that have led them to have difficult physical and emotional difficulties in having children or giving birth. An example that I have is one of my friends has had two girls. And in both cases, when she was giving birth, she stopped at 5 centimetres. And although both her girls are several years apart with two different fathers from different marriages, and her birth experience was identical, she rang an aunt who is very into family histories. So she said, do you think there is any significance in my problem in giving birth naturally? And I go through this terrible anxiety. She said, well, your father's grandmother, when she was coming over from Ireland, she was on the ship, she was pregnant with her second child, and she went into labour. Now, her 2-year-old was playing around and caught fire and actually died in front of her as this woman was giving birth. And for her, she just suddenly felt significant relationship between Irene, as she was called, Irene and her experience in that trauma. She feels that she carried the shadow of this woman's terrible situation. What we talked about, particularly with Sarah and her great-grandmother Irene, is that Sarah felt that her great-grandmother, really wanted to be remembered about what happened to her. And so she got her photographs out, she talked to her mother about it. She said, I think Irene needs to be remembered about this terrible trauma. She went along to Irene's grave, actually found the grave and went to the States, because that's where she lives, in New York State. And she felt that there was some healing for her to say, look, I remember this was an awful life that you had. And actually, we're kind of, I just want to honour that, to remember it. For her, that was enough. And she found now that she knows that she doesn't have to pass it on to her own daughter. She feels this, the shadow, the memory of the trauma has lifted.